Good morning. Welcome. My name is Cédric Marin, and I'm an immigration lawyer at Holt Immigration Law. And today, we're going to take your questions about how to immigrate to Canada. So welcome once again. It's 6:30 a.m. in Toronto, Tuesday. It is fall in Canada, beautiful fall colors. My name is Cédric Marin. I'm an immigration lawyer at Holt Immigration Law, and I'd love to know from where you're joining me from. So please post in the comments from where you're joining me from. Good morning to everyone. And today we're going to talk very briefly about the next express entry round for permanent residents that we expect to take place tomorrow. And then I'm going to go ahead and take your questions. So thank you so much for joining me. Ozan says, always happy to watch you from Kitchener, bright and early, 6:30 a.m. Well, 6:31 now. Ozan, nice to see you. We have also Cédric, who's very quick. First question already in. So please go ahead, ask me your questions. Start asking me your questions in French or in English. I'd love to answer your questions. Cédric, we're gonna answer your question right away, and then we're gonna talk about express entry. Cédric says, what is the timeline of security check, which is the last check before passport request, right? So if you're inside Canada, and you're applying for PR, or also if you're outside Canada and applying for PR, you're gonna have to go through a security check. And usually it really depends on your circumstances, your country of nationality, whether you did any military service, but really it's really facts specific. It can take anywhere from 30 to 60 to 90 days, but in some cases it can take much, much longer. So it's very, very fact dependent. I see a lot of returning viewers. Reka says, hi, bonjour. Hi, Reka. Bonjour to you. Amara Touré, also a regular, says, bonjour, Cédric. Côte d'Ivoire, joining us from Côte d'Ivoire. We have Reka says, I am Indian. Can you please advise for PR? Well, here we go, guys. Let's talk about what is probably the best program to immigrate to Canada. This means that it's called express entry. And as soon as you obtain your express entry, right, it means that you're going to come to Canada with your permanent residence, right? So let's talk very briefly about what is express entry. So eligibility for express entry, it's going to cover three main streams, right? So we have the Canadian experience class, which deals with people with Canadian experience, whether it's Canadian education, but really it's going to be focusing on, your eligibility is going to focus on Canadian work experience. So to apply to the Canadian experience class, you need at least 1 year of skilled work experience. A lot of individuals will come to Canada with a study permit, and then get a work permit, a post-graduation work permit, to obtain the 1 year of skilled experience to have a good score for express entry and qualify for the Canadian experience class. We also have, and Reka, to answer your question, Reka, we also have what's called the Federal Skilled Workers. Federal Skilled Worker Program is going to be for those outside of Canada. Again, here we're just talking about minimum eligibility, so the minimum requirements to be able to apply for the job, right? So you have to have 1 year, at least 1 year of continuous work experience in what we call skilled positions, so NOC O8 or B, right? There's other requirements, so how they calculate full-time, and there's other requirements to do with part-time experience, but generally speaking, you need at least 1 year of full-time work experience to qualify for express entry. You're also going to have, there's no education requirement, but it's going to be an important part of the education. Well, sorry, there is an education requirement, but there's no requirement to have a post-secondary education, right? So secondary institution. However, as we're going to see, to get points for express entry, you usually need to have a specific score that's high enough, and you're going to get that high score with, big part of it is going to be education, right? So the way it works, you have to meet the eligibility program, right, for the Canadian experience class or the Federal Skilled Worker Program, right? It's the minimum eligibility, the very minimum, just to be able to create a profile and apply. What happens is, if we take a look here at the rounds of invitation, so what happens is that the IRCC, what they do is they take all your profile, they take everyone's score, they add it up, and right now it's about every 2 weeks. So we expect one to take place tomorrow. Every 2 weeks, we have draws that take place. So the last draw, they took the best 3,700 candidates received permanent residence to Canada. So right now we can see that with a score over 500, which is very, very high, there's about 4,400 applicants currently, right? And then you can see here that there's a lot of individuals with 490, 480, 470, and so on. IRCC has a very handy tool called the CRS. I'm trying to find the CRS calculator here. I don't know if I have it tabbed actually. There we go, the CRS calculator. So you can actually go here, Rekha, and this is what I'd recommend to do is to get a rough understanding of what is your CRS points, to head on over to the CRS calculator and actually answer these questions here, right? So here you can, you get different points on whether you're married or single, whether or not your spouse is a Canadian citizen or not, whether or not how old you are, you get different points, right? So at 49 years old, you're not going to get any points. And then based on your education, as I mentioned, the education is going to be a very important part to whether or not you're going to have specific points, right? So take a look at the CRS calculator, look at the language scores, right? You have to do a language test. You're going to have to talk about your work experience and whatnot. Here, I'm just going quickly through this and just putting just random information in just to show you how it looks like, but answer all these specific questions about your express entry application, about your personal situation, and then you can calculate your score, right? So based on these random questions that I answered, I have a CRS score of 343, which means that I'm probably not going to get an invitation to apply if the current score right now of the last draw was 504, right? So something that we help our clients with is how to improve your CRS score. We can do that in consultations, but this is generally the big principle of it, of how it works in terms of eligibility and express entry rounds. And if you're curious, head over to the ministerial instructions, right? So over here, and here it's going to tell you with all this legalese, essentially how you get points for express entry. So here we can actually see how it works for age. You're going to see that depending on how old you are, you get various amounts of points, right? So essentially, if you're from 20 to 29, you get the most amount of points. And after 29, it starts dropping down. And the same thing for whether your education, right? So we talked about that. If you just have secondary school education, you're going to get 0 points. But if you have, for example, a master's or a diploma, you're going to get many more points. So there we go, guys. A very short overview of how it works for express entry, points, eligibility, and CRS and the ministerial instructions. So again, we're expecting the next draw to take place tomorrow. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. All right, let's get straight to the questions about immigrating to Canada. Again, I don't go necessarily in order. I try to take the best questions that can be applicable to the most people. So Raja says, hello there. Hi, welcome. We have Zarin says, good morning, Cédric, watching from Sri Lanka. Rekha says, my worry is age, which makes my points less. That's exactly it, right? So you do get less points. So you could look at getting a labor market impact assessment, a job offer. You could look at studying to Canada, getting a work permit, and then getting more work experience. Improving your language scores are all various options. Sorry, going back to Zarin here, says, good morning, watching from Sri Lanka. Good morning to you too. We have Mary who says, hello. Raja has a question. Go ahead and ask your question. Again, I don't necessarily go in order, but we have Ashgar who says, hi to you too, and welcome to our channel, guys. There's lots of information on our YouTube channel, and I'm so happy to be able to help everyone here today. All right, so let's get straight to the questions. Again, if you have a question, feel free to ask it in the comments below, and I'll do my best to provide general information about how to immigrate to Canada. So first question, do I have to have my education credential assessment report to have my express entry application accepted, right? So when we talk about express entry, Ahmed, we talk about two parts, right? So we do talk about creating a profile, and then you share all your information with IRCC, and when your score is high enough and you receive an invitation to apply, then you have to provide your documents, right? So to answer your question, you don't need, there's no requirement to have the ECA before you create your profile, but it's strongly recommended to do so. And the reason why is to properly create your profile, right? To properly indicate your type of education in there. And secondly, is that when you get your ITA, your invitation to apply, you only have 60 days. And if there's any delay, you have to decline the invitation, right? So the ECA is going to be, the educational credential assessment is required if you have foreign education, and it's going to be valid for 5 years. So if you're serious about immigrating to Canada, I definitely recommend that you get it done before you create your profile, before you apply for permanent residency, because it could take weeks to get that ECA report. All right. Desislav says, hello there. Any chances to travel restrictions in regards to quarantine for unvaccinated PRs who are landing for the first time? Excellent question. I mean, there's a lot of changes happening regarding COVID policies, including vaccination, the changes happen so quickly, and it's really hard to be able to answer this question because I don't know which ones are currently valid off the top of my head, which ones have expired. There's a lot of things, a lot of changes that are happening over the next few months. But listen, Desislava, I encourage you to look online. All the temporary policies are available online, and they actually explain when they expire. They might be renewed, but generally speaking, a lot of the COVID policies in place are ending in the short term. J2D2 says, hi, small question, sir. If you work as an engineer with the military, do you state your personal history as employment or military on the EAPR? Thanks in advance. So very good question. And it's possible that you have to answer. So what I recommend you do is you read the question very carefully. And in these cases, you're most likely going to have to disclose it in both, right? So there is a question about military experience and there is a question about occupation. And you can definitely disclose it in both because you just have to answer the question, right? So if you're employed in the military, right, they're going to want to know about that. And also it has to be disclosed for work experience. Ashkar says, in IT activities, is it okay when two activities, employment, unemployment, overlap? Or is it better to select another start time to avoid this and explain in letter of explanation? The unemployment is an unpaid activity. So Ashkar, really good question. And for the question regarding activities or personal history or work history, it's very important that you answer and provide correct information. So if you're a student and you had part-time jobs, it has to be disclosed even if it does overlap, right? If you were also a student or you were working and you had a side gig or two jobs at the same time, it has to be disclosed, right? So it does happen once in a while when activities do actually overlap. And that's the proper thing to do is actually to disclose it, right? This being said, is it okay if two activities, employment, unemployment overlap? I have difficulty understanding how you could be employed and unemployed at the same time. If, for example, I don't know, you were doing, volunteer work or a work activity that wasn't necessarily employment, then you could put the unemployment. But listen, it's getting a little bit tricky here. I don't have all the information and I just provide general information, general legal information. So I encourage you for sure, explain in your letter of explanation as to what's going on, because the visa officer might be looking at this and saying, wait, how are they employed and unemployed at the same time, right? But listen, it's very normal to have activities overlap. And in fact, you do have to disclose all these activities as I previously mentioned. All right. Ahmed says, so again, Ahmed, following up on what I was saying, so the problem is I got my ECA, my wife is the primary applicant. We have also all the info in order. The only thing is missing is her ECA. We filled out an application with all the correct info, but it was rejected. I mean, yeah, like as I mentioned, you do need to have the ECA when you apply for permanent residency. And as I mentioned, I definitely recommend that you have it way before you apply because it can take some weeks to get, right? So if you don't have an ECA and you complete your ITA without it, it's for sure going to get rejected. And in fact, you can take a look here. The IRCC has what's called a completeness check for permanent resident program subject to express entry. So this means this is what they're looking for in terms of your applications, right? And in specific for in your situation, the educational credential assessment is required. If you don't provide it, you will get rejected, right? As it happened to you. So let's take a look here. Mandatory documents, right? Proof of studies. All right, this is us here, proof of studies. Let's take a look here, right? To receive program specified points for education, the applicant must, right? You must do this. Obtain the ECA and provide the ECA reference letter in their application along with proof of the foreign educational credentials for which the points are being claimed. So you provide, right? You provide the reference number of the ECA, you provide your degree, you provide the transcripts, right? And you make sure that if it's in any other language than English or French, that you respect the rules up here as it relates to the translation of documents, which is another really important factor of the completeness check. So this is, I wouldn't say it's a common error to have it rejected, to have an education rejected. The most common errors are usually proof of work experience. This being said, it's definitely an avoidable error that you definitely want to avoid if you're going to be applying to PR second time around. All right, let's take a look at some more questions. We have Wusang here says, do you think all program draws will still take place after the implementation of C19? Well, we'll be able to get 500 plus next February, but my occupation is definitely not in demand. This is an excellent question. So as many of you may know, coming up in express entries, they're going to change the way that express entry is being done. So right now, if you take a look at express entry, it's really based on the points. So, we talked about the points earlier. The highest the points, they take the top candidates and off you go. But the issue right now is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the people with the highest in-demand occupations are coming to Canada, right? So what's going to be happening is that with the changes that are going to be announced, again, we don't know the full details, but what we expect, and which has been confirmed by the minister, is to have employment-specific draws, right? So they're going to look at the NOC code, and they're actually going to look at whether or not they're going to look at the NOC code, and they're going to ask themselves, okay, is this occupation in demand? Do we need doctors to go to Alberta? Absolutely, right? And we're going to go ahead and accept all the doctors in Alberta with this NOC code, regardless of the CRS points, right? So just something to keep in mind that we're occupation specific, location specific, maybe even education specific are going to be expected, right? But I personally expect they're going to continue with the CRS points, continue by taking applicants with a score of over 500. But I think we're going to see more and more draws on occupation specific and location specific and whatnot. So excellent question. And fortunately, my answer right now is kind of just stay tuned. But I do expect, again, just an informed guess, we don't have all the details, that this is going to be coming out with location specific, and they're going to continue the CRS draw. So fingers crossed. All right. Uzan has an excellent question. So for those of you who joined me last week, the minister announced changes to what's going to be happening for international students. So in particular, they're lifting the 20-hour requirement, but the 20-hour rule. So if you're an international student right now on your study permit, again, depending on your study permit, you're most likely allowed to work on or off campus for a maximum of 20 hours per week. And they're not lifting that rule, but the other conditions on your study permit continue to apply, right? So if it's on or off campus or healthcare and whatnot, continues to apply. Excellent question, Ozan. Mark has a great TR to PR video as well that he just made, talks about the TR to PR and whatnot. But listen, I think a big reason why not much has happened this summer and why we expect things to happen in November and December, it's because Parliament was not in session, right? So the Parliament takes a break in Canada, take a break for the summer. The minister, doesn't go to the House of Commons. They don't pass bills and whatnot. And then Parliament has now resumed, which means that we expect a lot of changes to take place. The Liberal Party also had a caucus, a big meeting this summer about what they're going to be doing, their next strategy plans and whatnot. And there was that document that was released about expanding, strategies for permanent residents. So listen, stay tuned. I plan to do much more of those live announcements with you. But listen, we don't have much information right now. Hopefully it's going to take place in the next few months. Mary, great question here. Should I specify in EAPR personal history activities if employment has been remote, or only mention the city where I do it would be enough? Thanks a lot. So Mary, as you know, when you go in your personal history activities section, it's going to ask you about your work experience and whatnot, and it's going to ask you where has this taken place, right? And in that case, right now, you could put where your office is located, right? If it was a temporary measure because of remote, you could put the location being, for example, if it's in the same country, obviously, put where it's taking place. But listen, I definitely encourage you, if you put remote or if you put the city, to provide a letter of explanation to explain the relationships and what is happening, right? So your relationship with the employer, why you were remote working because of COVID, where your home address was, where the company's located, where the work was taking place. So there's no clear guidance right now as it relates to this, but we do encourage you, as it relates to the remote part of it, to explain it in a letter of explanation. Mary has a good question here. Says, hi, should unpaid volunteer activity in personal history be under unemployment or under organization, as it's a global charity? Thank you. Excellent question. In this case, so when we talk about volunteer activity, was it really a volunteer activity? And here it says global charity, or was it more of a case where you're just not getting paid for work experience? In any event, it doesn't have to be disclosed. If it was volunteer activity, you could put unemployment, or you could also put organization. But I think if you could provide a letter of explanation, again, the forms are not really well built for volunteer work. They're not very well built if you have other things to add, right? So what I would add is actually in the short letter of explanation. I'm sure you already have one. If not, you could provide more details about this specific employment. This being said, if you're truly unemployed, right, if you're not working and it was truly volunteer work, then you could put unemployment and then provide an explanation that in fact it was volunteer work, right? But do declare it in your section that you were doing volunteer activity, whether or not you put right the option of organization or unemployment. Just make sure that it's declared that you were doing volunteer work with global charity. So there we have it. All right. Roy says, do you have to declare work experience in Canada that is not skilled and has no points for express entry? So very interesting question, right? So we talk about express entry. We talk about the creation of the profile, where you just create a profile. And then if you have enough points, you get the invitation to apply and you actually apply for permanent residency. And a lot of people get this confused. They think that once they create the express entry application, express entry profile, listen, I just confused myself. A lot of people think that when you create your express entry profile that you've applied to permanent residence. And I've seen people who then apply for a bridging open work permit because they've applied for permanent residency and they say yes in the applications, I've applied for permanent residency. But no. When you create the profile for express entry, you're just creating the profile, right? You have not submitted an application if you've not finalized your electronic application for permanent residence after an ITA. So Roy, to answer your question, when you create your profile, the question is asking you about work experience for points, right? And that's where you need to declare your Canadian work experience. If you're going to be applying to the Canadian experience class, that's where you would need to disclose to show that you meet the minimum requirements, that you have at least 1 year experience in a NOC, OA, or B inside Canada, right? But when you get your ITA, there's going to be another section where they're going to ask you about all your work experience since the age of 18 or in the last 10 years. And this is less of a work history and more of a personal history, right? They want to know when you were studying, when you were unemployed, if you did military service, and there can't be any gaps in time. So then at this point, when you are completing your application after the invitation to apply, at this point is when you're going to be able to that's when you need to disclose all the employment, the unemployment, the volunteer activity, all the mandatory military service. That's where you need to disclose it. So there we have it. So when you create the profile, to answer your question, you do not need to provide it. However, when you go to apply, you absolutely do need to provide it. And that says my immigration consultant says it's good to put spouse's work experience and express entry profile. Reason is my wife, primary applicant, has been working in a firm as an employee. So just to avoid confusion, we shouldn't put it in the personal history section. So just to avoid confusion, right? So we talk about the profile creation and we talk about the invitation to apply when you're creating your application. So the question is different, right? So when you create the profile, they're going to ask you about the work experience for points, right? If your spouse, for example, if someone is working a NOC D position inside Canada, right, it does not obtain points for express entry. It does not need to be disclosed, right? When you read the question carefully at the profile of the application, it does not need to be disclosed when you create your profile. However, when you go to apply, when you actually submit your application, there's going to be a section for personal history. There's going to be a section, and the question is going to ask you about all the previous work in the last 10 years, right? And then you need to disclose when you were in school, the part-time jobs, the unemployment, the volunteer activity, and whatnot. So if in your profile, right, as I mentioned, you have work experience that are not getting you points, or you have, let's say, foreign work experience that not only does it not get you points, but you don't have the completeness check, right? You can't prove that you worked in a family business in this specific NOC, right? You can't get reference letters. You have foreign work experience. The company doesn't exist anymore, and you're not even claiming points for it. You don't need the points because you have your Canadian work experience, right? Well, in that case, when you create your profile, you would not disclose, you would not use this work experience as points, and you don't have to include it when you create your profile. However, when you go to submit your application for permanent residency, there's going to be a question that asks you all about the last 10 years, and then you would disclose this, right? So there's two different questions, two different stages, but just to summarize and to avoid any confusion, read the question extremely carefully. And generally speaking, when you create your profile, you're just going to be including your work experience for points. And then when you apply for permanent residency, there's going to be a question about the last 10 years. And then you have to disclose everything in the last 10 years. So there we have it. Rory says, thanks. Listen, my pleasure, Rory. I hope it was helpful. And that says, is this correct? I just answered it. I hope it was helpful to you. Again, profile, ITA, two different questions. Read them carefully. If you're not getting points for it, you don't have to disclose it. All right. Fraj says, and I see somebody else has Taklu has another question as well. Says, I've received my stomach permit refusal the 27th of September. Following that, I applied for the GCMS notes. I already had approval. My visa was valid until April 30th, but I did not travel because of the pandemic. Okay, and the question is, sir, it was refused, but I already had a study permit, did not travel at the time. So it's hard to say, Raj, why it was rejected. I do deal with rejected study permits, rejected PR applications and whatnot. And just on what you provided me, it's hard to explain why it was rejected. And another similar question here, after applying again, my application was rejected. So listen, it's really tough here without knowing more, right? So common reasons for the rejection could be if you did not respect a condition on your study permit. So if you previously studied without authorization, if you previously did not respect the conditions on your study permit, they could refuse to extend your study permit. You also need to meet the same requirements, right, for the extension. So did you provide a letter of acceptance from the university, right? Or the college or the designated learning institute, right? So there are requirements when you do apply, and it's hard to know which one you fell short of, right? Also, if you applied for a remote program to do a remote study program with a study permit inside Canada, right now, because of the COVID policies have now been lifted, you need to do it in person, right? So if you applied for a remote study permit and it's not in person, well, listen, they're probably going to reject your application. If also you haven't respected the conditions on your study permit, that's another reason why it could be rejected. Mary says, why should we provide details about all activities, etc. in APR letter of explanation, or only when necessary? I wonder when I must explain things, it's confusing. Listen, Mary, the applications, right, are kind of a one size fit all. They're really not made for situations where you have, volunteer works, when you have multiple countries of residence, when you have things that don't line up, right? So listen, it's I think that any time that your answer doesn't necessarily line up directly with the question. So in your case, you have volunteer experience, but you put unemployment, but really you were volunteering. In that case, I would recommend to provide the letter of explanation. Again, the idea is to make it as easy as the immigration officer to have your application, read it, understand what is going on, and approve it, right? So you don't want, for example, to have unexplained things where they have to ask you for more documents. You don't want anything that could possibly be seen as an inconsistency when in reality it was something very minor and you're able to explain it, right? So when you have possible inconsistencies, when your answer doesn't necessarily answer the question directly, when you have other issues like this, well, then it's definitely best to explain it in a letter of explanation. Elias says, Brusha says, I submitted my Saskatchewan immigrant nominee program application with husband accompanying 2 weeks ago, now filed for divorce in court. Should I inform Saskatchewan or wait till I get a final decision? Aliyah, kind of a tricky situation. Generally speaking, you do have an obligation to inform IRCC and in this case, the provincial nominee of any changes in your circumstances. And so I would recommend that even if you're waiting for a final decision, that you could inform them of this change in situation, right? In Canada, there's also a period where you could be separated. So from somebody else, and then which can also have a divorce, right? So listen, it's kind of a tricky situation, but generally speaking, you do have the obligation to inform them of any changes, and I wouldn't delay informing them of filing for divorce, right? Because it could impact spouse's eligibility, spouses coming with you, and so on. For everyone who's just joining us, thank you so much. Again, my name is Cédric Marin. Head on over to our website here, Health Immigration Law. And this is our website. We have lots of resources. Today, I was actually publishing some blogs, publishing some questions about when the CRS score is going to drop under 500, common express entry applications, how to immigrate to Canada if you're Francophone. We have lots of new content that is being released. So I encourage you to head on over to our website. We really want to work with people who want to maintain control of their application. And this is how we work, right? So our approach to doing things is what's called a collaborative review approach. In other words, we ask you to essentially do a first draft, and we do assist you with many resources about how to prepare your documents and so on. But we ask for your documents, and then we do our collaborative review approach. So we review your documents. You maintain full control of your application in your IRCC portal, right? We are not going to be acting as representatives, but we do give you a letter for immigration to let them know that you've retained us, that we have reviewed your application and given you advice, but you maintain full control of your application, and we offer a collaborative review. So we review your documents for the completeness check, make sure it's properly entered into your express entry application, and it's a very different way of working. We work one-on-one with lawyers. There's no personal assistant. There's no consultants. It's one-on-one with an immigration lawyer. And take a look more about our approach, how we work, but we do want to work with people who want to create their own immigration applications, and at the same time need help from a lawyer to make sure that it's properly prepared to avoid any issues or possible delays. Head on over to our website, speak to a lawyer here. We have my colleague Alicia, we have Chanel, and here I am at the very bottom with what I work on. I do a lot of litigation, including rejected applications, reconsideration requests, mandamus for delayed applications, but also express entry, work permits, and study permits. You can learn more about me, go here and about our team. You can scroll down on Cédric. So I used to work for the government of Canada, and I also used to work with the United Nations, and I'm now been a lawyer for about 5 years. So take a look at my website, who I am, my education, and so on. I'd love to speak with you to learn more about your immigration situation. All right, let's continue the questions. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask them in the comments below. Oops, I lost the comments section. Uh-oh. Let's get this linked up again. Oop, my program that I use for the questions, there we go. It's back online. All right, let's look for our next question here. Mohammed has a question about graduation. So I graduated from Concordia, Montreal as an international student, and I had to go back home. If I do an online postgraduate certificate from a Canadian university, will this give me extra points for express entry? So let's go take a look at what we need to do for express entry. So you graduated from Concordia, so you do have Canadian experience. I don't think you have the 1 year of qualifying work experience, so I don't think you're going to be able to get the Canadian experience class. So let's take a look at the federal skilled workers, and let's take a look at the eligibility, right? So we talked about the minimum work experience. So the question for you, Mohammed, even before talking about your education and whatnot, do you meet the minimum requirements to apply for express entry? So in your case, do you have 1 year continuous work experience, right? Continuous work experience. And that's going to be a question for you before we even talk about your education and whatnot. Keep in mind as well, express entry is to immigrate outside of Quebec. It does not apply to Quebec. All right, let's head on over here. Let's go back and let's take a look at your question. All right, so you ask about is a postgrad certificate from a Canadian university, do an online postgrad is going to give you points. And the short answer to your question, Mohammed, is no, it's not going to give you points. There was a few months that They did because of COVID, but that has ended now. So if you did an online degree, or if you had to attend online because of COVID, there was some exceptions because of COVID. And we can actually go and take a look at those exceptions. But generally speaking, if you're outside Canada and you do Canadian work and you get Canadian credentials, you will not obtain points for Canadian education because it was not in person. Let's just try to find it here. Education. Where are we? Highest level of education. Let's see here. There we go. So if we take here the requirements, so one of the requirements for points to be assigned under subsection 1 is for the purpose of obtaining accreditation, the foreign national studied or trained at a Canadian institution that is located inside Canada, right? So if you do it online, this first requirement is met, then it has to be full-time, right? Another condition, but here we go, right? Was physically present in Canada for at least 8 months for that study program or training. So Mohammed, to answer your question, before we even talk about this, my question would be, are you eligible for express entry? Do you have your 1 year of foreign work experience or Canadian work experience? And if not, it's definitely something to get. Second question, well, to answer your specific question, no, online education does not count for points for express entry. And then my third question for you is going to be, have you considered a post-graduation work permit, right? Have you already applied for this work permit? Because it is available for you to get Canadian work experience. The post-graduation work permit, there's some requirements to meet, but generally speaking, if you studied at a designated learning institute full-time, you might be able to get a work permit after your studies to get that Canadian work experience. Mohammed says, thank you in advance. My pleasure. All right, let's take a look here at our next question that we have. Anat, I think you had a similar question, or if not, I've seen a very similar question on my live Q&As asking about applicants being paid in cash. What supporting documents in addition to the reference letter? I just have salary certificate as supporting document. My question, so paid in cash, was it deposited into a bank account? Can you explain why it was paid in cash? I definitely recommend to explain the circumstances in your letter of explanation. And now there are dealing with a little bit of discretion, right? Because you are supposed to demonstrate that one of the key elements for work experience is that you were paid, right? Unpaid work experience do not count. So how do you demonstrate that, right? So ideally, we would have, we would have the salaries included in the reference letter. You could have certificate of salary. Your employer could provide you with a letter that you're paid in cash. If the money was deposited into a bank account, provide further receipts. But pretty much, or if your contract also mentioned that you're paid in cash, you can also demonstrate that, right? So try to think about job reference, if they can provide you a letter, if they can provide you with, if you yourself, you've deposited the money in cash, or try to also provide more context, right? But listen, it's definitely something that you want to avoid. If you can have it being very clear that this position was paid is going to be a very important requirement. This being said, you can definitely try your best and explain your efforts that you did, right? What efforts have you done, right? So you could explain, I did not deposit the money in cash, right? I do not have a contract. This was, I do have the contract, but it was paid. Here's a letter from my employer, which provides more context, right? So it's hard to know more about your personal situation, but I think the best way when you're missing documents is explain the efforts you've done to obtain it. I contacted my employer, they haven't replied, right? My employer moved, I'm not able to reach them. However, look at this contract that says that I was paid, right? So think about trying to explain it and to the best of your abilities for visa officers. Tech Luke says your consultations are really expensive. We are immigration lawyers. We are not consultants. We do have also, if you just head over to our website briefly on About Us, Mark and Alicia both have over around 15, more than 15 years of experience each. And myself, I do have 5 years. So we're all immigration lawyers. We are not immigration consultants. This means that we went to law school for at least 3 years. Me, myself, I also did a a civil law degree and a master's of law. And so we do have a lot of experience with immigration law, and we are lawyers. We are not consultants, right? So our consultations are more expensive than immigration consultants, but we do have a lot of experience with assisting clients with their applications. And it's kind of a situation of you get what you pay for, right? Do you want someone who spent a lot of time and who has represented a lot of clients and who's worked various positions previously and gained experience, and they have studied for quite a bit? Or do you want to go with an immigration consultant, right? So it's really up to you. You do get what you pay for. We were not the most expensive, but we were definitely not the cheapest either. Well, says, and I think, sorry, and just to conclude this, I think one thing that we do well that other firms don't, as well as we actually advertise all our legal fees. So the consultation with us is really the first step to learn more about your case, learn about express entry, great opportunity to ask questions. And then here we can actually look at our legal fees are advertised up front, which again is very different from other law firms or immigration consultants. So here we have all their fees for permanent residency, for work, study, rejected applications as well, to go to federal court to argue, which immigration consultants can't do. They can't go to federal court to do judicial reviews or delayed applications. So take a look at our website. Again, we provide legal services. We are a law firm, and you are dealing with lawyers. Wes. All right, let's go back to our questions here. Wes says, hi, if I apply today for express entry, do I need to pay application fees again next year? That is in October. So again, we're dealing with the creation of the profile, and then we're dealing with the actual application fees, right? So these are two different concepts. For the fees next year, again, in October. Well, unfortunately, I don't know if you've already applied for express entry, if you're just talking about the profile. So I think we'll just leave it at that. But listen, it's very important right now to have an express entry profile because we're expecting different types of draws to take place on occupations and location and whatnot. Shahir Razman says, I've seen so many YouTube videos regarding converting visitor visa to study permit. Is it doable? Should I try this route? Should I apply for a study permit or should I apply from a study permit from home? So, Shahir Rahman, listen, during COVID, there was a lot of exceptions that took place for COVID, which allowed people who were already inside Canada, because essentially Canada's borders were closed for a lot of foreign nationals, people outside Canada, some exceptions obviously, but generally speaking, Canada had restricted people who were coming into Canada, right? So for immigration purposes, a lot of new programs like temporary residence to permanent residence, the TR to PR, healthcare programs, changes to who can apply inside or outside Canada for various things. A lot of COVID policies changed these rules because people were essentially stuck inside Canada. But let's go take a look at the immigration and refugee protection regulations for who can apply inside Canada. And generally speaking, I would avoid looking at other YouTube channels who guarantee success, or even people who guarantee success. Hire me, I guarantee you're going to come to Canada. Look, I've done it for 10 other clients. You can't do that, right? You can't guarantee success. What we guarantee is that we do our best to prepare your application according to the regulations and the laws to avoid delays and issues, right? But people who guarantee success, pay me $10,000 US and we'll get you a visitor visa. We'll come get you then a work permit, your PR, your passport, pay half up front. Listen, it's illegal to do that, to give false promises. You cannot do that, right? But let's go take a look here. With that aside, let's go take a look here about who can apply for a study permit inside Canada within the regulations here. So what we're looking for is around section 200. 200 is workers. It's for students. So let's take a look here at the general rules for students. So here we talk about students, and let's scroll down here to the next page. Let's go look here at who can apply for a study permit when entering Canada, right? So these are individuals' study permit when entering Canada. So at the port of entry at the airport. So if you're a national or permanent resident of the United States, person who's been lawfully admitted to the United States as a permanent residents of Greenland, residents of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. So these are people who can apply at the border for a study permit, right? You can apply after right, after entering Canada. So in this case, you've entered Canada as a visitor, and now you want to make an application for a study permit. So let's go take a look here. So you can make an application for a study permit if you hold a study permit. So you can make an application for an extension, for a new study permit if you already hold a study permit. In this case, we hear about more legalese here. So apply within the period of 90 days before the expiry of the authorization to engage in studies. So if you have an authorization under the Act to study in Canada, you can apply for a study permit. You can apply for a study permit if you hold a work permit. You can apply for a study permit if you hold an unenforceable removal order, or if you're a temporary resident who meets these requirements here, so an exchange student and whatnot, or your section described in section 207. So this is the immigration and refugee protection regulations about who can apply for a study permit. Now you're going to see here, it doesn't say that a visitor inside Canada can apply for a study permit, right? Only if you meet these conditions here, you're able to apply for a study permit after entering Canada. And then, as I mentioned, there was some exceptions during COVID, but generally speaking, you need to apply for your study permit outside Canada if you don't meet these conditions, right? Again, if you are a family member of a foreign national, right, if you're a family member of a foreign national, may apply for a study permit after entering Canada if the foreign national resides in Canada and the foreign national holds a study permit, work permit, and so on. So this means that if you're a spouse to someone who's already in Canada on a study permit or work permit, well, then you can apply for a study permit, right? So again, I would be very skeptical of switching from a visitor visa to a study permit inside Canada. Generally, the same rules apply for work permits, right? You can't come to Canada with a visitor visa saying, I'm here to visit my family. And then you get into Canada and a week later, you're attending interviews and trying to find a job and visiting campuses. That's not how it works, right? This is not how it works. IRCC wants you to apply, as we saw in a lot of cases, outside Canada, because you can only apply from inside Canada if you meet some of these conditions. Again, some COVID exceptions took place, and a lot of them are expiring, or a lot of them are very specific to people who are inside Canada during COVID. But again, generally speaking, don't come to Canada with the intention of, I'm going to find some work and switch to work permit, never going back to my country. It's not going to work. All right, Shuka says, I received a procedural fairness letter, but it was not mentioned anywhere in any GCMS notes I ordered. What does that mean? So procedural fairness letter, just to give a little bit of background, is that before visa officers or immigration officers reject applications or make misrepresentations finding, they offer this letter called a procedural fairness letter. And this essentially outlines the concerns they have with your application. For example, you may have omitted work experience. You may have lied on your application. You might have provided false documents. In most cases, you're going to get a procedural fairness letter. And here it says it was not mentioned anywhere in any of the GCMS notes I ordered. I'd be curious to know when the GCMS notes were pulled from the system when you made your request, right? What does that mean? It's really hard to know what this means, but generally speaking, there should be more information in the GCMS notes, but I'd be curious about when they took the information from the GCMS. And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner also has certain guidelines on when you can make complaints and whatnot, but reach out to IRCC to see when they pulled the information. You might have to make a second request. You can also might be able to do a complaint in some situations. All right, guys, we're going to be wrapping up our live Q&A in a few moments here. Thank you again so much for joining us. Let's take a look here. So, interesting question regarding processing times. Is it accurate on IRCC processing times simulator for federal skilled workers? So if you head over to the website here, you can go and check out the delay for a lot of immigration programs. And before COVID, Express Entry was being processed in about 6 months, and now it's taking considerably more time, right? So 26 months for decisions, again, after you apply for Express Entry to get your PR. Now, it's very difficult to say whether or not this is accurate. Some people get it earlier and some people get it much later, right? So this is kind of an average, Cédric, to answer your question, I think so, yes. So this is an average. They wouldn't be posting the number if it wasn't accurate. You can see here, last time was updated, was last week. It's updated weekly. There could be delays here as well for people who didn't pay the right to permanent resident fee, people who have to redo medical exams because it expired. All of these individuals are in here in this 26 months, right? So it's a good estimation. Some people do get it earlier. Some people do get it later. All right, so interesting question. So here it says, I've already applied for a visitor visa. If I don't visit and apply for a study permit from home, will it conflict? So generally speaking, these are both the visitor visa and the study permit are both under the temporary residence, right? So you're coming to Canada with a temporary intention to study, to visit, and then you return to Canada, return to your country after your stay inside Canada. So these are both temporary applications in terms of visiting Canada with a temporary intention, right? But how can you demonstrate at the end of your stay in Canada, you're going to return home, right? Do you have sufficient funds to support your stay during Canada? Do you have sufficient funds to return to your country, right? Why would you return? Do you have a job waiting for you? Do you have property, your spouse and children back inside your country, right? These are all things that you want to think about and explain in your letter of explanation to demonstrate to immigration officials that you will leave Canada at the end of your stay. But so here, Sharar, just to answer your question briefly, general information is that these are both temporary programs that deal, and the intention itself are both temporary, so it doesn't necessarily conflict. And it really depends, right? More about your personal situation, but some individuals, are able to come to Canada, visit, many times, and then return to their country, make an application for a study permit, and then come here to study. But as we talked about, it has to be made outside Canada unless you meet one of those requirements that we talked about. All right, guys. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining me. This is going to conclude our live Q&A. And just want to take a quick moment here to talk about some of the stuff that we have happening at the Canadian Immigration Institute. So if you link in the description, but in the Canadian Immigration Institute, we do have courses. So the next one coming up is a spousal sponsorship course. And we also have an express entry coming up. You can take a look here at the very bottom to see what is included in the course. So we have 340 minutes of premium content, talks about learning the basics, all the way to how to complete the forms, to gathering your supporting documents. So this is a very interesting course about how to sponsor your spouse to do your own application. Also includes 5 hours of live masterclass with Mark. So Mark's going to take your questions one-on-one with other individuals. So take a look at our spousal sponsorship course about how to prepare your own immigration application for a spousal sponsorship. We also have, if you go back to our main page here, subscribe to our newsletter. So we have a lot of content coming out, as I've talked about. You can subscribe to stay up to date. And very briefly on our website here, resources and blogs, here are some of the things that we talked about in our last newsletter. So last newsletter, we talked about what is the most common mistake for express entry applications. So we asked Mark, Chanel, Alicia, and my comments at the bottom here about what the most common mistake that we see when people hire us after a rejected express entry application, or they asked us to review a profile and they did, they tried their best. These are the most common mistakes and most common refusal grounds. So these are stuff that we publish in our newsletter. We also published little snippets on our website, but do take a look. As I mentioned, if you want to speak to us, head over to Holth Immigration Law, speak with a lawyer, and then here at the very bottom, we have our calendars, availability, prices, and what we focus on. So there we go. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me. Please hit subscribe. We have a lot of content on our channel. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. Bye.